So yeah, I'm really excited today to introduce Liz Hobson. So Liz got her PhD in biology at the New Mexico State University, and then she followed that up with two postdocs, one at the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, or NIMBUS, I think you're supposed to pronounce it, even though it's spelled NIMBIOS, in Knoxville. And then she was also recently a postdoc at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And she has just started her own lab like this past year, I think, at the University of Cincinnati as an assistant professor. I think Liz's background is very interesting and sort of true to the collective behavior spirit, because she got her, she spent most of her early years working as a hardcore field researcher. She did tons and tons of field work on birds, many different types of birds and in many different types of places. Just to name a few: terns, macaws, honey creepers, hawks, parrots, monk parakeets, and I'm told now penguins, potentially. But then these days, Liz actually mainly works more on the data side, looking at data from a wide range of species, including birds, but not just limited to birds, and also some simulation data. And she does a lot of work, very exciting work, developing quantitative and computational tools for analyzing social behavior and how it links with ecology and evolution. And so her research these days focuses primarily on social knowledge. And as she puts it on her website, she studies what animals know about their social worlds, how they come to know it, and what they do with that information. Just to mention again that there's going to be a virtual coffee chat with Liz tomorrow at 1 p.m. And you can always ask me if you need the link, but I will also put the link in the chat so you can grab it from there. And with that, I would like to introduce Liz. We're looking forward to your talk, and yeah, take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ari. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here today. So as Ari said, I've had a really interesting career trajectory, I think, so far, of starting with field biology and then going in the computational direction. And what I'm doing now with the new lab is trying to bring those two streams together and unite them. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today. But the thing that I really think is fascinating about social structure and animal social structure is this connection with cognition. So I'll illustrate kind of how I think about how animals are balancing the costs and benefits of sociality, and the kinds of ways that cognitively they might be processing the information that they need in order to make those kinds of more optimal or more beneficial decisions. So a lot of work has shown that social relationships, especially in some species with particular individuals, can have strong fitness effects. And what we think, and what many people have thought for a long time, is that tracking and managing those social relationships might be cognitively challenging. So this has led to a lot of hypotheses, such as things like the social brain hypothesis, which suggests that the computational demands of sociality may have required greater cognitive capacity in these animals. But there are a lot of assumptions underlying this kind of hypothesis. And the major one is that sociality is hard, and that it's harder than other demands like foraging and other things. But what we really don't know right now is we don't have a good idea of the cognitive load of sociality, and we don't even know what animals actually know about their social structures and their social relationships for most species. And so I think this is a really fascinating gap in our knowledge, right? We've got a lot of these hypotheses about how all these things might be interacting and producing these sometimes complex societies that we see in animals, but we don't know these like major foundational concepts. And so what I've done in my work is really latch onto that and try to see what we can infer about the cognitive side from the social side of how animals are interacting. And so to illustrate that, I focused in on three main questions. So what do animals know about their social worlds? How do they perceive, process, and store this information? And how can they use this information to make decisions about how they're interacting with others in their groups? So this kind of perspective has led me to think of social systems as a feedback system. And the feedback is between actions, which you can see here on the left side, and information on the right side. So what you can see here is animals are interacting. Those interactions are producing some kind of information in the system, but then that information is filtered and processed through the perceptive, recognition, memory, and inferential abilities of whatever species or individual that you're studying. Some of that some of that information is retained, and depending on what kind of information is retained, animals on the action side may make different decisions about their future interactions. So you can see, you can think of this feedback loop as two different stages here. So the creation of social information and the creation of structure, but also how the structure, once it's created, may then constrain the future decisions of animals going forward. And what I like to do in my work is to drive this process backwards and say, okay, what are animals doing? And what kind of information do they need to have in order to act in the ways that they do? And so driving this process backwards allows me to use the behavioral side of things in order to infer the cognitive side, or at least the information side. Okay, and a lot of my work has focused on aggression. And one of the main reasons, I think, is aggression has a really strong connection, potentially, to cognition. Not always, but that's reflected in this saying that we have, choose your battles wisely. And if we break this down, we've got choose here, right? So there's a decision between several choices. The battles part, conflict is present and expected in a lot of systems. And the wisely part is there is often a cognitive component where some choices may have better outcomes than others. And so what I like to do in animal groups is focus in on groups with aggression, and especially groups where structured dominance hierarchies emerge, and say, okay, in those groups with dominance hierarchies, how much do individuals have to know about their own rank and the rank of others in order to act in the ways that they do? So as Ari mentioned, a lot of my work is an integration of traditional approaches with more computational tools. And so I started out as, a very pure field biologist doing a lot of behavioral observations and captive experiments. So you can see these are a couple pictures of me in the field in Argentina and in Florida catching and observing parakeets. But from there, what I did is go in a very computational direction. So I integrated network analysis and other kinds of computational modeling to start to understand, what are these complex patterns that we're seeing with the interactions? And then I also really enjoyed doing species comparisons and developing generalizable frameworks in order to understand kind of broad species comparisons and to try to understand sociality across a wide range of species. And so this is reflected in the composition of even in my new lab. So as Ari mentioned, I just started my lab in the fall of 2019, so just barely pre-pandemic in the before times. And what you can see is this really strong comparative focus that I have is really reflected in the study systems that my group is focusing on. So you can see here, this is an image showing my 2 postdocs, Anna Marie and Grace, and then my 5 graduate students, and connections here to all of the study systems that various people are working on. Okay, so how did I get interested in so many systems and in people working on such a range of species? As I mentioned, I started in field biology and really focused on parrots and parakeets initially. So what I'm going to show you in the talk today is the story of essentially how this happened. And I'm affectionately referring to the talk today as the there and back again story. So what I'm going to show you today is the progression of starting with interesting questions in parakeets, moving to comparative work, and then moving back to parakeet systems. All right, so I started with parrots and parakeets because parrots share many traits with other socially and cognitively complex species. So they have extended developmental times, long lifespans, large relative brain sizes, and complex cognitive skills, which makes them a really good study system for thinking about the connections between sociality and cognition. They also have other characteristics which are not as common in some of the other mammal and primate species, although some do show these. So parrots are well known for having high fission-fusion dynamics. They're socially monogamous, and they're vocal learners, which is something that most primates outside of humans don't actually do. So they're a really good comparative system for thinking about the evolution of social and cognitive complexity, and especially in comparing it to what we can see in other primates and other mammals, because they're obviously not a close relative of primates, for example. All right, so I focused in on one of the more tractable of the parrot systems, the monk parakeets. So monk parakeets are native to temperate areas of South America, and they're notable for both their highly social nature and their success as invasive species. Oh, and if everybody could mute on their side, that would be good. I'm getting a little bit of background noise over here. So as you can see from this graphic over here, you can see that they're native here to temperate South America, but then all these red circles here show, highlight just a couple of their invasive populations. So they've been transported worldwide by the pet trade, and they've formed many successful feral populations around the world. So I've worked with wild populations in Argentina and captive populations in Florida. And all that work is focused on trying to form a foundation of what sociality looks like in these birds. So some of my more detailed work on sociality comes from the captive experiment. So here's an indication of the field site in Argentina. And then this is what the captive system looks like. So all of this work, as I said, is geared towards figuring out the foundations of sociality in the parakeets. And you can think of these as the socio-cognitive building blocks of parakeet society. So in a lot of my work, I've tried to go through and kind of point by point figure out, what kinds of social interactions do these birds have, and how does that relate to the cognition that might be underlying that, or the cognitive skills that they would need in order to show these behaviors. So what I'm going to show you today is some of the work on aggression and hierarchies in the parakeets. And just to give you a little bit more of a feel for how I work with this kind of system, to study aggression in the parakeets, what we do with the captive populations is mark them with the extremely technical method of drawing all over their faces with Sharpie markers. And then we release them into a large semi-natural flight pen outdoors. And then we observe them over the course of several weeks. And so here I want to mention that the marks, we have no evidence that the marks are changing their social behaviors. But what we can do once the groups are released into these large flight pens is observe how they're interacting, how the groups are coming together and building their social structures, and how they're fighting with each other, which will be the focus of the talk today. So aggression in the parakeets is mostly proactive. So targets are generally actively chosen, and the decision to be aggressive is almost always the decision to become the winner. So once aggression takes place, it's mostly clear in their directionality and the outcome of the event. So I'll give you a little example here. So highlighted here in the red circle is the aggressor. That one is leaning over this guy in the middle and aggressing against the one highlighted in blue here. And then in less than a second, that red highlighted individual becomes the winner as the blue highlighted individual is displaced and leaves the area. So importantly, these events happen very quickly, And they also happen within a potentially social context. So here in yellow, I've highlighted all the individuals that are in close proximity to these events and could have been watching the events. So depending on what kind of information they're able to take in and process, they may be remembering, for example, who the individuals were that were fighting and what was the outcome of that fight, even though they themselves were not involved in the actual fight. So what I then do with all the aggression is rank all the individuals based on their fights. And here the rank embedding is done with a modified PageRank algorithm. And I can talk more about all of the methods behind this afterwards if you'd like. But basically, we take a matrix of all the times each individual. So for example, A here wins against all other individuals. So here A is winning against B 12 times. And then we can use the modified PageRank algorithm to rank the individuals both in continuous space and also ordinally. So here you can see the ordinal ranks of two separate groups of monk parakeets, from the high-ranked individuals at the top to the low-ranked individuals at the bottom. But it's important to remember that it's not just the rank that's important here. It's also the underlying networks of aggression that contributed to the emergence of that individual's rank. So here you can see a similar kind of picture, but now I've overlaid the aggression networks on top of things. So you can see all individuals, again, ranked from high-ranked to low-ranked individuals. But here now you can see all of the fights between individuals. So all the blue ties on the right side of the networks are interactions or fights when a high-ranked individual fought and won against a low-ranked individual. And all the edges on the left-hand side in red are cases where a low-ranked individual fought and won against a higher-ranked individual, essentially breaking the direction of the hierarchy. And as you'd expect with a structured hierarchy, you see a greater weighting of these rule followers on the right-hand side and much more sparse edges on the left-hand side over here. So what we can do with these hierarchies then and the ranks is to say, okay, we've got all of the actions that individuals took and the ranks that emerged from those actions. But then what we can do is take the rank information and cast that back onto the actions and say what kind of rank information might have been needed for birds to make the decisions that they did. So here I want to take you on a brief interlude about statistical inference in networks, which can be very tricky. So the way that I like to think of statistical inference in networks is through thinking about reference models. So often for statistical inference, we think about null models. I really like the use of the term reference here because it really highlights the notion that we're not comparing observations to a completely random scenario that contains no predictable patterns, but rather to a system in which certain features of interest are preserved and others are randomized. So I'm going to be showing you a couple examples of how I've used this approach with collaborators to get statistical inference into how decisions are being made in these animal societies. If you're interested in this approach, along with collaborators, I recently released a preprint. It also has an 80-page supplement for anybody excited about worked examples, which goes into a lot of detail on the different methods. But in general, with these reference models, you can come at these from two different directions, right? You can take the observed network structure and you can sequentially break little pieces of it and say, okay, does the reference model network structure that you recalculate, does that still match your observed network structure? Or have you broken something critical? Coming at this question from the other direction, you can set up rules, for example, in an agent-based modeling approach and say, okay, can we set up a model that produces network structures that closely resemble the observed? And in both cases, the goal here is to say, okay, is the structure in your reference model a plausible generating mechanism for the observed network? All right, so in the context of aggression, I'll break down a couple ways that we set up these kinds of reference models. So for rank-based information, what we do for the individuals is to use a plot like this. So we've got rank difference on the x-axis. In the middle for each individual, and this is recalculated for each individual in the group, each individual's own rank is in the middle here. So we're recentering every time depending on where that individual is in the hierarchy. Individuals ranked above that individual are towards the left. Individuals ranked below that individual are towards the right. And on the y-axis, we have the amount of aggression. So here we can see the amount of aggression each individual is directing towards others in its group, given those relative rank differences between themselves. So this, in a case with no rank information, so also no dominance hierarchy, what you might see is something like this, where the amount of aggression is not influenced by these rank differences among individuals. So individuals in this case might fight equally with all others in their group. If you have a case with categorical rank information, this might be a case where individuals know who's ranked above themselves and they avoid fighting with those individuals, and they know who's ranked below themselves and they fight at a relatively equal rate with all the individuals that are ranked below themselves. You can also imagine a scenario where individuals might have more detailed rank knowledge. So here is a case where individuals would have more continuous knowledge of rank differences between themselves. And in this case, what I'm showing here is fights are increasing with the increasing rank difference between individuals towards lower ranked individuals than themselves. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is some work that I collaborated with Simon Dedeo on. So Simon is affiliated with both the Santa Fe Institute and Carnegie Mellon. And we teamed up to look at using this kind of approach and developing some new computational methods to work with the parakeet data. So as a reminder, we're going to be modeling this kind of detailed rank information. If you want more information on how we actually set up the reference model, I'll refer you to this, the 2015 paper down here. But in general, what we did is we have group 1 and group 2. And for novel social groups where the individuals hadn't all interacted before and we just kind of threw them into the flight pen for the first time all together, what we can see is in the first 6 days, the novel hierarchy is forming relatively quickly. So here we've got the same kind of format for the plots with the rank difference on the x-axis, average aggression on the y-axis, and we've got the 2 separate social groups, group 1 and group 2. So in blue here, you can see the reference model, which is modeling this detailed rank information here. And in red, you can see the real observed pattern. And what you can see is that in the first 6 days already, the real observed pattern is overlapping really well with our predicted pattern from the reference model of detailed rank information here. What we saw afterwards, after looking at these first 6 days, was really interesting though. So I'll show you that. But in general, in these first 6 days, these patterns of aggression were consistent with this detailed rank information, even early in novel group formation. So this is showing that the hierarchies are forming and emerging really quickly. So if we look past the first 6 days, here you can see a slightly different format where I've got group 1 up on the top, group 2 below, and divided all the observations into quarters. These are 6-day periods. And so you can see what you just saw before in quarter 1 here. If we look past that now to quarters 2, 3, and 4, what you see is the observed pattern in red starts to diverge from our expected pattern in the reference model in blue. So what this is showing is that rank-dependent aggression is emerging quickly to structure the choices that parakeets are making about their targets of aggression. But we found a new strategy. So you can see it especially strongly right here, where aggressors are preferentially targeting close-ranked opponents. And so this really motivated some of the future work that I'll show you in just a second. So what I showed you in this section with the parakeets is how parakeets appear to be able to perceive their own rank and the relative ranks of others in their groups. and how individuals use rank information to preferentially target close-ranked opponents. So now we're going to move on to thinking about a more comparative perspective. And these kinds of patterns, and especially that new pattern that I mentioned, the close competitors pattern, really motivated this future work with the comparative side. Because what I wanted to see now was, okay, how common are those kinds of strategies? Do we see those in other species? Is it related at all to something that we'd think of as the cognitive abilities of those species? So what I did here was team up with a new team, working with Simon again, and then also working with Dan Munster, who's at Aarhus University. And what we focused on again was animal conflict, because aggression and dominance hierarchies are, in my opinion, our best case scenario for doing any kind of widespread comparative work across species, because it's our best option for a real apples to apples comparison. So these aggression structures and hierarchies are widespread across the animal kingdom. They're biologically relevant to the animals in those groups. They're an emergent pattern. And as I said, I think they're one of our best cases for being comparable across lots of different species. Okay, so in order to do these kinds of comparisons, the traditional method to infer rank perception in animals focused on pretty time-intensive manipulative experiments. So to give you an example, some of these experiments focus on fights and aggression where audio can be recorded, so audio of the actual fight, and the audio itself can indicate to observers who was the winner and who was the loser in that kind of fight. So what researchers did is go out and record audio of an actual fight where you've got a real winner and a real loser. They go back into the lab and then manipulate the fight. So they reverse the apparent outcome. So the apparent winner now is the real loser, and the apparent loser is the real winner. So they flip things. Then what they do is go back into the field with their flipped version and say, okay, do uninvolved individuals, do they notice that the order of this outcome has been flipped? And then they can measure responses. So for example, how surprising or unusual are these reversed fights? And primates are great because they make these like very surprised and shocked looking faces, which you don't get in the parakeets. But as you can see, this kind of approach can give you really great insight into what's going on, how the animals are perceiving the predictableness of these kinds of interactions. But this is really time intensive and really relies on a system where this kind of manipulation is possible. And so for doing comparative work, this kind of approach is really hard to do in lots and lots of different species. So what I did with my collaborators is focus more on the computational side of things and use new computational methods to look at animal conflict data. And what we had access to, thanks to Dai Shizuka and Dave McDonald publishing this great paper in 2015, is a historical data set of conflict and aggression in animals dating all the way back to 1934. So this is a great opportunity for us to go essentially on a treasure hunt to try to find some interesting patterns even in these old data sets. So here in the data set, we have data for groups, social groups of animals, and how they fought each other in 85 different species across 23 orders in 172 social groups. So you can see here, I've got the number of social groups plotted on the y-axis. So you can see that some of the groups, for example, primates and passerines, are incredibly well sampled compared to, lizards down here, for example. So there is a bias in the ways that people are studying aggression and dominance hierarchies in groups. That's a good thing to keep in mind for the future results here. Okay, so what I did with Simon and Dan then is we developed some new measures to quantify general patterns that are underlying aggression in these systems. So the two new measures that we developed were based on the distribution of the aggression in the hierarchies. So here, again, this is the same format of the plot that we looked at before, with rank difference on the x-axis, average aggression on the y-axis, and then here a little sketch of a distribution of aggression. And so the first measure that we developed, we called focus, which is how concentrated this aggression is given the rank differences between individuals. So for example, focus might be concentrated here. This would be a highly focused system. Then the second measure that we developed was we called position, which is, okay, we've got a focused system, but where in the hierarchy is that aggression concentrated? So in this example, position might fall around here. And so now we know not only do we have a highly focused aggressive system, but the peak in aggression is focused a quarter of the way down the hierarchy from any one individual's position in the hierarchy. Okay, so these results that I'm going to show you here are contained in an archive preprint. This paper is also in press at PNAS. We're still under a press embargo right now, but I have special permission to share all of these results with you today. So what we did, now that we had those two measures of the social structure and the patterns and the hierarchies, is we use those two measures almost like a social assay to try to set up a taxonomy of different kinds of social dominance patterns. So I'll give you some examples of those here. The first one that we looked at is very similar to what I told you before about that categorical rank information. So here we called it the downward heuristic. And the rule here is that all the animals in the group should focus on attacking any individual ranked lower than themselves and at a relatively equal rate. So here, for example, you see all the aggression is directed towards the lower ranked individuals. You've got a relatively focused system because of this skew in the aggression. And the position is right around halfway on average. So then we also a couple other social dominance patterns. So close competitive is, again, really motivated by the work and the patterns that Simon and I were finding in the monk parakeets in the first section of the talk. So in close competitors, animals are ranked close below themselves. So you can see here, it's a focus system, but the position has to an individual's own rank here. Then we also came up with a strategy called bullying, which is attacking others that are ranked far. You can see here the position is dragged further each individual's own rank. And another critical thing to recognize here is that these social dominance in the number of parameters, which we're using as a proxy for the complexity of patterns. So for all of the patterns, individuals need to act as if they know who are and below themselves. But for close competitors and bullying, animals as if they know who's ranked close below versus far below themselves. So they need to know a little bit more detail about the relative rank differences between themselves. Okay, so what we can do then is set up a reference model. And our reference I'll go into in a little bit more detail. It is randomly rewire the aggression network. So if we have a simple aggression network here, where the edges here each indicate a single fight, the arrows indicate the fight pointing towards the loser of the fight. And then the numbers with label each individual's rank in the hierarchy. So I want you to focus on this red edge here, rank 1 individual to the rank 5 individual. What we do with the random rewiring is the end of that edge from 5, and we reconnect it to the individual in the group that's ranked lower than the originator of the aggression. Here is the rank 1 individual, so we can anybody else in the group. So here, for example, we've randomly the rank 3 individual to reconnect that edge to. So we can do this over and over again to rewire the entire. What this kind of approach does and preserves some basic things about the social structure of the group. So it preserves the number of individuals in the group, the number of contests that each individual won, and each ordinal rank doesn't change with this process. What this reference model breaks is which lower ranked individual was beaten in each contest. And so the reference model that we're building here is consistent with the downward heuristic, randomly attacking anybody ranked lower than yourself. Okay, so we can set that up then and see when we rerun the social history of the group, what the overall summary measures of focus and position look like for our rewired networks. All the networks where they're following this downward heuristic perfectly, then we get on average about 0.8 for focus and on average about 0.4 for position for each of the social groups. But if with animals, you know that nobody ever follows the rules exactly. And we wanted to allow for some level of mistakes or gain in here. And so what we did is introduce some noise. And so here, each contest or each fight can follow this downward heuristic rule or be assigned. And so we can increase the amount of noise and the proportion of those fights that are randomly assigned all the way up to 100% random. Then we draw a polygon around this and we say, okay, if the real data, the real observed data is falling within this polygon, then the downward heuristic is a plausible generating mechanism for the observed data set. If it falls outside, then something additional is going on. So use this then to kind of assay each of the groups and say, is it falling, is the real group, the observed group, are their focus and position values falling within this polygon or not? So with the downward heuristic, this is an example from mule deer where the focus and position are as expected if they're following a downward heuristic. But you can see over here with the parakeets, the position and the focus are falling outside of that polygon. And the position here is being dragged closer to 0, closer to an individual's own rank, which is indicative of this close competitors strategy. In bullying, for an example from vervet monkeys, position is dragged further away from 0, so further away from an individual's own rank. And so we can go through for each group, model each group's specific distribution of aggression expected from the downward heuristic, and then in each case categorize the social dominance pattern for each of those 172 groups. So we did that for each of them. And then here, what you can see is kind of a raw plot of the focus and position values for each of these 172 groups with the strategy type, these social dominance pattern types, indicated by the colors. So we've got this dark gray as the downward heuristic, blue is bullying, red is close competitors. And what you can see is the majority of social groups are following this downward heuristic pattern. So 77% of the 172 social groups are consistent with a downward heuristic. And you can see here, this table breaks down all of those groups based on the order that they belong to. You can see here the number of species that we have in the data set and also the number of independent social groups. And then a heat map to show you how common each of those different kinds of strategies were across the order. And so here, by order, you can see the number of groups with complex strategies. And so several of these groups are showing up as having complex strategies. And the complex strategies are either the close competitors or the bullying. So we found that 22% of all of the more complex social dominance patterns. Okay, we can break that down too and say any evidence of phylogenetics at the level of the orders here. And so in this case, what I did is randomly reassign all of the strategies to each of those 172 social groups, and then re-summarize at the order level to see how many how many groups within the order had each strategy when they were randomly assigned. And what you can see here is that in almost every order, the observed number of groups with each social dominance pattern was consistent with the expected number of patterns with these randomly distributed groups. So you can see that each of the observed patterns are in these short vertical lines, and those overall are falling within the distributions of what's expected if we just randomly assign all of the strategies and social dominance patterns to the groups. Okay, so this was a little perplexing. We expected initially, or I expected at least, to see some sort of pattern here where, the species that we think of, or the orders that we think of as traditionally more cognitively complex, would be more likely to have these more complex strategies. And this is something that came up during the review process for our paper. So we got really excited about the cognitive angles. The reviewers said, rein it in on the cognitive side. And they said, what about a case where your types of aggression can produce a more complex pattern with little information? So what I want to do here is really highlight a case where peer review went really well for us. We added this whole new model to the project based on reviewer comments in this section. And if any of our reviewers are watching, thank you. Thank you so much for these comments. This really, really enriched everything that we were trying to think about. So you can think about information in these hierarchies in a lot of different ways. So you can break it down in terms of the social information, the amount of social information, and the type of social information over here. So I broke this down in a recent paper, but what I want to focus on here is a low information case. So here, if we highlight this, a low information case in some cases might be when individuals only remember what happened to themselves. And so a good example of that kind of low information case is a system with really strong winner effects or loser effects, when an animal that's either won or lost a contest is much more likely to win or lose in future contests. And here, the information that each individual retains, it only has to know its fight history, and it only acts solely based on the fight history outcomes. So regardless of the identity of the opponent. And so here, no recognition or other memory is needed. No idea of relative rank differences between individuals is needed. And so what we did is go in and model this with an agent-based model. So we asked, is individual information enough for the emergence of these more complex social dominance patterns of close competitors and bullying? So we modeled a lot of different combinations of winner and loser effects using, toggling which ones were present and whether they were transient or persistent in the system. And what you can see here is a similar plot to what I showed you before. These are the model outputs with the social dominance patterns identified on here. What you can see if we summarize these patterns is that the vast majority of these modeled groups are consistent with a downward heuristic. And only rarely do we see these more complex patterns emerging. So what we conclude from these agent-based models is that this individual information is sufficient to consistently produce systems conforming to these simple downward heuristic rules, but only rarely do they produce systems with more complex social dominance patterns. So this gives us more of a basis of saying that these patterns are more complex and are based on more social information in the groups. So we can flip back over to the observed patterns in the animal social groups in the historical data set. And what we looked at too is species where we had multiple groups of individuals that were sampled within the same species. And what we found is that groups within species also showed different social dominance patterns. So for 37 species with multiple sampled social groups in the data set, 17 of these, so 46%, had multiple social dominance patterns, so more than one social dominance pattern. And 3 of the groups in the data set actually had social groups that were showing all three different social dominance patterns. So what we conclude from this section with the comparative work is that these social dominance patterns don't show any strong evidence of being phylogenetically restricted, and they appear across a wide range of taxonomic space in lots of different kinds of species. These patterns likely should not be considered to be species-level characteristics because several of these groups used multiple different patterns. And this, I think, is a really intriguing result, and one that motivated the return to the parakeets here in the last part of the talk. So what I'm doing with my group and with some current work that we're working on is digging into this pattern more and saying, within a particular social group, how do decision-making and social dominance patterns change when the system is perturbed in different ways? So for example, if you've got a network of parakeets, which are fighting in an aggression and dominance hierarchy, what happens if you remove one of those individuals from the group? And so what we're looking at is how social groups can change which strategy they use over time. So what we're essentially doing is taking inspiration from the early work with the parakeets, where you can see this is a plot just slightly modified from some of the first ones that I showed you, where you can see for group 1 and group 2, the distribution of aggression, but now color-coded by the type of social dominance pattern that they were using early in group development in the first 6 days. So this first group was using a pattern consistent with a downward heuristic, and the second group was using a bullying social dominance pattern. But then as rank stabilized and the group structure stabilized over time, what you see is a shift towards both groups using a close competitor strategy or a social dominance pattern here. And so what we wanted to do then is to go back to the parakeets, set up a new dominance hierarchy, and then start kicking the system and say, okay, does the social dominance pattern change if you remove any individual? Does it depend on the rank of the individual that you remove? And so on. So what we did, this is data that we collected in new work led by my postdoc, Anna-Marie van der Marel. And we started new data collection last spring in March 2020 with the parakeets. So you can see all of their new headshots here. The study was going really well. And then, like many studies around the world, our work was unfortunately disrupted by COVID. So what we had to do was close the whole field season and evacuate everybody. But this is an interesting example of a way that we salvaged the field season and pivoted to a computational question. So involving several of the grad students in my group and led by the postdoc, Anna-Marie, we have a new paper out where we ask the question, are two similar looking behaviors functionally interchangeable? And this will be really useful as we move forward and thinking about which behaviors to plug into these aggression analyses. But what I want to show you is a couple really intriguing, very, very preliminary results with a very small sample size. So here, this is a figure made by Anna-Marie that shows the dominance hierarchy in the new group from 2020, again, from the most dominant individuals to the least dominant individuals. And this is when it had stabilized. But then this is what happened when we perturbed the network. So here we intentionally removed the top ranked individual. We also had to remove the bottom ranked individual because of health reasons. And then what we can do is chart how each individual's rank changed following that perturbation. So what you can see here is that we've got several individuals that increased their ranks, some individuals that decreased their ranks, and some individuals that stayed remarkably similar in rank. So we've got a lot of complexity in the reshuffling of the hierarchy structure here. We also wanted to know how the social dominance patterns might be changing due to these perturbations. So what you're seeing here is a plot where along the x-axis is showing the number of, or the day in study time. And on the y-axis are categorical representations of the three major social dominance patterns that we looked at. So the downward heuristic, close competitors, and bullying. And so during the habituation phase, what we saw is 2 of the days we had a downward heuristic, 1 of the days we had a bullying social dominance pattern. That's when the hierarchy was just starting to form and was likely relatively unstable. But following that period, during the period that we think is more of a stable representation of the hierarchy, what we saw is more consistent social dominance patterns of bullying. And then what we did is here we did the perturbation and the removal of those individuals. And then what we could see is how the social dominance pattern changed. So here, right following the removal, is the first time that we see a close competitor strategy emerging. So unfortunately, we had planned a whole series of these removals, but COVID hit right here. So we had to pivot. But we are planning on going back. And so the team, hopefully, pending all the safety considerations, hopefully we'll be able to get back down and conduct more detailed work and longer term work with the parakeets this year. And so the plan is to do these sequential removal and reintroduction experiments. So we're going to remove a particular bird once the social structure is stabilized. Then we're going to look at how the social structure and the dominance hierarchies are structured during these unstable phases after we've kicked the system and perturbed it. And then go back in and resample and say, okay, now that it's had time to potentially restabilize, what do things look like now? And then reintroduce that individual and say, does the social structure reset to what it was pre-perturbation, or does that individual that's reintroduced now have to re the system? And we're going to do that sequentially with different birds that are different ranks or different kinds of, have different kinds of social properties within the groups. And so this will give us a better idea of the kinds of perturbations that might change the use of these social dominance patterns in the groups. And these new experiments hopefully will give us insight into the factors that cause these shifts and cause shifts in decision-making about aggression. We've also got new work using a different model and a different social behavior, but looking at very similar things. So asking the question of, does decision-making and cooperative behavior, in this case, does that change when the system is perturbed? So this is new work, newly funded work that I'm collaborating on with Jerry Carter and Ian Hamilton, and using Jerry's amazing vampire bat system to ask these kinds of questions about decision-making and social structures in the face of perturbations. All right, so what I showed you today was my perspective on the evolution of decision-making, various different kinds of decision-making, especially in terms of aggression, social cognition, and the cognitive skills and information that might underlie those decisions, and how more complex sociality might emerge from a combination of these things. So in my work, and what I've showed you today is how I take a multi-scale framework approach to these different questions. So I like to think about, on a small scale, how individuals make decisions, on a medium scale, how groups structure their societies, and on a larger scale, how complex sociality evolved across different species. And I also like to think of the connections between these different social scales. And I think taking this kind of approach with looking at questions on various different social scales, and especially focusing on the connections between them, allow us to ask some really interesting questions. So for example, what are the adaptive responses that groups could show to changing conditions? For example, with our perturbations. And also, on a larger social scale, what are the evolutionary constraints on these social responses? How plastic or how flexible can species be in terms of responding to perturbations? So I think these are some really exciting new directions for the new lab. And I'll be hopefully excited to visit you all in person at some point and give you an update on all of this. So with that, I thank everybody very much for your attention, and I'd be really happy to answer any questions.
First of all, fantastic talk, Liz. I thought it was really, really interesting stuff. I have lots of questions actually, but I'll just pick one. So which one should I pick? So yeah, I guess one question I had when looking at your patterns of individual like aggression towards different like relative ranks is, are there, it seems like you managed to capture a lot of the variation with like basically these two parameters, the focus and the distance or whatever. I was just wondering, like, do you feel like that captures most of the variation, or like were there some other weird strategies that came up that were sort of like didn't fit into that framework?
Yeah, so most of them did. So I think it was something like 97%, I want to say off the top of my head, of the groups were conforming with one of those three major social dominance patterns. There were at least a couple groups that were very unstructured. And so those were cases where the dominance hierarchy didn't really have that much structure. I mean, if you looked at those groups, the decisions that animals were making or the fights that they were engaging in were consistent with what we'd consider, 80% random decision making. And so for those, that's indicative of like there isn't really a hierarchy there. And so those relative rank differences are probably either not present or if they are there in like a tiny little way, they're probably not very useful. So those were a couple cases that we found that didn't conform to those. All of this historical data that we're focusing on with the big comparative study are all papers where the goal was to go out and document a dominance hierarchy, and the papers were published about the dominance hierarchies. So it is biased towards like species that actually, or groups that actually had dominance hierarchies. So it'd be really interesting to go in and start to include, cooperative groups in here and say, okay, well, maybe there's a popularity hierarchy. Do you see kind of similar types of patterns? And that's one thing I've been thinking about with the new work in the parakeets, is that we could essentially use a similar kind of social dominance pattern, but the social popularity pattern would be slightly flipped, right? So the mirror image of close competitors would now be your slightly more popular individuals than you, for example, that you might want to associate with. And the bullying pattern would flip over into a ingratiating pattern or something where you'd be trying to curry favor with really high ranked individuals, for example. So I think there are some interesting ways that we could flip the perspective for like a more cooperative affiliative situation.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I think looking at some grooming data, for example, could be amazing for that.
Oh yeah.
There's a question from Eli in the chat.
Hi, Eli.
Hey, Liz, great talk.
Thanks.
And you did such a good job of like predicting my questions and answering them before I got a chance to ask them. For example, I was about to ask about, like combining this sort of adapting this paradigm for non-aggression data to look at how these patterns might be the same across these different contexts, because I totally agree with you that dominance is a really great way to look at social structure, because it's one of the systems in which we understand social structure the best. But also, like, one thing that's tricky about dominance is that it's hard to measure the aggressions that don't happen. So it'd be really cool to look at this, like look at these strategies in context with like your ingratiation strategy or something like that. But so the question I am going to ask, sorry, that's not even a question. The question I am going to ask is, I think the interspecific differences are really interesting. And I'm wondering whether, I guess maybe you could talk a little bit more speculate about what you think is driving that. Like, do you think it's individual, like features of certain individuals in the group, or do you think it's something more about the culture of the group, or is there another explanation?
Yeah, well, I think you've hit on a couple really interesting points, right? Like, so some of these more complex social dominance patterns don't have to be a high cognitive load on the individuals in order to use them, right? There could be cognitive shortcuts that individuals are using in order to get the same kind of, or that like allow the same kind of pattern to emerge with very little cognitive processing. So for example, a lot of fish have size-based hierarchies, right? So if you have a rule in those systems where you say, okay, I'll attack anybody ranked slightly smaller than me, and I have a strong preference for that, then you get a really nicely structured close competitor strategy without any kind of reference to who that individual is that you're attacking and your fight history with that individual and that individual's fight history with everybody else. And so you could really see that as a cognitive shortcut. So that might be a way that some of these more complex dominance patterns are popping up in species that traditionally we haven't thought of as highly cognitive complex species. I think also, I mean, a caveat there is, have we really looked at a lot of these species? Are we really convinced that cognitive skills cannot be underlying some of these patterns? And so I think that some of the interesting stuff that we uncovered with some of the more complex patterns popping up in these species gives people a guide to species where maybe we should take another look and see, is there any evidence of interesting cognitive skills that might be underlying these kinds of patterns? I think on the other side, when you're thinking about the role of a particular individual in the group or the culture of the group in how these patterns emerge, you could definitely think of a group where, for example, you've got like a strong bullying pattern. A newcomer that joins that group, in order to function well in that group, might have to learn the essentially like this microcultural pattern to fit in properly in the group. So it could be a learned pattern. That's one thing that we're hoping to start to tease apart with these perturbation studies, is to see how much do you have to kick the system before you get a change, or is it very resilient to those kinds of perturbations because of maybe like a strong cultural memory of the individuals that are in the group.
This was really a beautiful talk, very nice work, fantastic. I may have missed this, but did you take into consideration relatedness within the group? And how does that affect the whole pattern?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'm glad you're thinking along those lines, because that's metadata on the individuals that we do not have for the historical data sets. And we don't have it yet for the parakeet groups either. We're hoping to get it with the parakeet groups, so we're planning on catching new feral birds from southern Florida and bringing them in and running SNPs on everybody so that we can figure out who is a close relative versus not a relative. So try to disentangle the social preference for an individual from a kin relationship with that individual. One of the ways that we can get at that more directly is with Jerry's work on the vampire bats, where he has a much better idea of who's related to who and who are forming relationships with each other. So I'm hopeful that in the future we can start to address that, but that's definitely something that is tricky to address with that big historical data set.
I think totally agree, but I thought potentially more on the comparative approach, because you have all these different species. Do you think you will be able to do, I mean, taking your nice result that, you know, even within a species, you have all these variation, but just in general, because some people push for these, it has a huge influence. Do you think you can do those analyses?
Yeah, so I investigated those. So I did, you know, a bunch of ancestral state reconstructions and did some of the more typical kind of phylogenetic approaches to looking at where these strategies were popping up for the different species. The problem is that we had several species where they were using multiple different strategies. And I became convinced that potentially this is a plastic response to the conditions under which that group was experiencing. And so then, because of both of those, it's hard then to use the traditional phylogenetic approaches for something that is so flexible and plastic. And so that's why I kind of went up to this very kind of gross scale approach by looking at the orders. And so neither way that I looked at it, you know, looking at the orders or looking at the species themselves, was coming up with any kind of detectable phylogenetic signal.
Great, thank you.
what is the influence of group size on the amount of conflict, strength of relationships, etc.? Would cognitive expense limit group size and determine optimal group size?
Yeah, thanks, Katya. So that's a good question, and that's I think it's interwoven with researchers' ability to get good data on social groups. And so I don't think we have a good way of really testing for this in dominance hierarchies right now, just because once you get many individuals in a group, it's really hard to keep track of who's interacting, and the number of interactions can just get a little bit overwhelming. So there are some studies that are looking at larger group sizes, but it gets a little bit tricky. And most of the historical data sets are falling within the kind of like 6 individuals up until about 30 or 40 individuals. So falling within that range. So I think expanding from there and trying to look at groups that are larger would be really interesting, because I think you're right. You know, at a certain case, individual recognition gets really, really cognitively difficult to process, right? From my own experience, I have a really hard time recognizing people, which makes it really tricky to go to conferences. I'm really glad with Zoom that we have everybody's names on people's pictures. That makes it great for me. But for me, you know, joining a larger group just gets really cognitively overwhelming, just because I can't track who's who. And I could see that happening for definitely a lot of these other species. You know, the social brain hypothesis originally was really geared towards how many other individuals do you have to know and remember in your group. And so I think that, yeah, they're depending on the type of way that they're processing and remembering information, that group size could be really critical, and kind of set a critical upper limit for some of these species in terms of which of the social dominance patterns they're able to use.
So it seems like a hierarchy is a particular form of social structure, and like a particularly simple one, because everything can be mapped onto a line, basically. I was wondering if you have thoughts on how to apply similar methods to behaviors that end up either dominance behaviors or other types of behaviors that just end up being non-hierarchical and start having cycles or whatever. Yeah, just curious to hear your thoughts on how you might even start approaching that.
Yeah, I mean, that's traditionally how we've approached animal dominance hierarchies, is thinking about a linear hierarchy. I don't think it necessarily has to be linear, right? You could think of more of a tree structure where you've got a top-ranked individual and then several kind of slight subordinates that are all in charge of their own kind of mini hierarchies below themselves, and organized more in kind of that kind of hierarchical system. So I think a little bit more digging in terms of, you know, how are these systems actually arranged? You know, we've kind of, with the current approaches and the current methods, in a lot of cases, we force those to be, do you conform to a linear hierarchy or not? And I think looking a little bit more creatively at those structures can really tell us some interesting things. I think in terms of when you're thinking about cycles and all these like nonlinear patterns, in those cases, you know, the current methods and the current approaches of, you know, the computational methods that my collaborators and I have been developing, that would really break down, right? So if you've got lots of cycles, then you don't have clear rank differences between individuals. And so then they couldn't be using these rank-based social dominance patterns. So it might be a different kind of heuristic, right? Where something else would emerge that could explain those kinds of patterns. Right now, what we've done to approach that kind of situation is say, you know, there might be some noise, right? And the noisier that the system gets, the more that it contains cycles and irregularities and things like that. So those we've kind of pushed over to that side of the analyses right now. But I think digging more into those would be really interesting, especially in systems like things like cooperation or popularity, where you might not necessarily expect this really strict linear dominance hierarchy.